Chapter 31. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, and then into night, Horace became increasingly restless and bored. He shifted position continually and sighed repeatedly. Will steadfastly ignored him. This annoyed Horace, who knew his friend was intentionally taking no notice of him. Eventually, after a particularly extended sigh, followed by a prolonged shifting of position and shuffling of shoulders and buttocks, Will could no longer pretend not to notice. "It's a pity you didn't bring a trumpet," he said. "That way you could make a bit more noise." Horace, pleased that he had finally provoked the beginning of a conversation, answered immediately. "What I don't get," he said, "is why we didn't run the cart out here now, instead of doing it hours ago. We could have waited comfortably in the trees until nightfall, then run out, lost the wheel, and had only an hour or so wait for Mallkallam's monsters. It would have been much less boring than crouching here all afternoon and into the night." "It's supposed to be boring," Will snapped. "That's the idea." "You want to be bored?" Horace asked. "No." Will spoke very patiently. He adopted the tone an adult might use talking to a very young and naughty child. It had been some time since he'd done that with Horace, and the warrior found that he didn't like it any more now than he had previously. "I wanted the sentries to be bored. I wanted them so used to the sight of this cart that it became part of the scenery. I wanted them to look at it for hours and hours with absolutely nothing happening, so that they eventually believed that nothing is going to happen. If we'd only come out of the trees now, they'd still be suspicious when the time comes, and they'd possibly still have an eye on us. This way, they've seen the cart clearly in full daylight, and they know they have nothing to fear from it. They are bored with it, in fact." "Well, maybe," Horace said reluctantly. Actually, what Will said made sense, now that he explained it. But still, it was boring sitting here. And cold, too. They were sitting on a mixture of melted snow and saturated grass. And the earth itself still held the bone-numbing chill of winter. As he had the thought, Horace felt an overwhelming need to sneeze. He tried to smother the sound, but only succeeded in making it louder. Will looked up angrily, shaking his head in disbelief. "Will you shut up?" he said tautly. Horace shrugged an apology. "I'm sorry," he said. "I sneezed. A person can't help it when they sneeze." "Perhaps not, but could you try to make it sound a little less like an elephant trumpeting in agony?" Will told him. Horace wasn't prepared to take that lying down. Crouching down, perhaps, but lying down, never. "And of course you'd know what an elephant sounds like. Have you heard an elephant?" he challenged. But Will was unabashed by his logic. "No," he said, "but I'm sure it couldn't be any louder than that sneeze." Horace sniffed disdainfully. Then he wished he hadn't. Sniffing only created the urge to sneeze again, and he fought against it valiantly, finally quelling it. He knew Will was right. The sneeze had been particularly loud. On the ramparts, the sentries were of a similar mind. When Horace sneezed, the corporal in command looked at one of the soldiers standing by him. "Did you hear that?" he asked. From the soldier's reaction and the way he was staring into the darkness, it was obvious that he had. "It sounded like an animal," he said uncertainly, "in pain." "A big animal," the corporal agreed. They peered into the night together. Fortunately, neither of them connected the strange sound with the ruined cart. Will was right. They barely noticed the dark shape anymore. "God knows what goes on in that forest," the corporal said eventually. "Whatever it was, it seems to have gone now," said the sentry. He hoped he was right. 20 meters away, under the cart, Horace had his cloak doubled over his head and his fist rammed up tight under the soft cartilage between his nostrils to prevent another sneeze. The following day, he would find a bruise and wonder how it got there. When the urge eventually subsided, he sagged against the cart, his eyes streaming. Will, who had seen the immense effort he had gone to in order not to sneeze, patted his shoulder. "Good work," he said sympathetically. Horace nodded, too exhausted for further comment. The moon rose, passed over them, flooding the land around them with pale light, then sank below the tops of the trees in the west. Will felt his heart rate begin to accelerate. The time of waiting was nearly over. He looked at Horace and realized his friend knew it too. He was no longer shifting and twitching. Instead, he was slowly and carefully stretching his cramped arm and leg muscles, easing out the kinks caused by long hours of inactivity. Carefully, the tall warrior unfastened his round buckler from where it was tied to the side of the cart. Will watched as he removed the thick white canvas covering the front of his shield, to reveal the glossy white enamel surface with its gleaming green oak leaf symbol in the center. "Good to see you'll be fighting under your true colors," he smiled. Horace smiled briefly in return. He was becoming focused now. Will could see that this was a different person to the fidgeting, complaining Horace who had sheltered under the cart for the past 8 hours. This was a very deadly, very serious Horace, a master of his craft, and Will was glad he was here. Once they hit the top of the ramparts, he knew it would be Horace who would bear the brunt of the fighting until the Scandians could make their way up the ladder to join them. He couldn't think of anyone he would rather have by his side. He realized that he had preparations of his own to make. He checked that his quiver, with its 24 grey-shafted arrows, was firmly in position. His longbow was tied to the underside of the cart, and he untied it now. It was unstrung, of course. There was no point leaving it under tension for the hours they had spent waiting. He checked that the string was in position, without any tangles or loops. The bow had a draw weight of 85 pounds, and it would be virtually impossible to string it in the cramped position under the cart. He'd do it as soon as they moved out from under the shelter of the sloped roof. He checked the big sax knife at his belt and touched his hand to the throwing knife in the hidden sheath at the back of his collar. The sheath's position was a little awkward, and he remembered how he had been unable to reach it quickly during the fight with McHaddish. He made a mental note to tell Holt and Crowley that the collar sheaths were a bad idea. In the distance, from beyond the far side of the castle, they heard the drawn-out moan of a ram's horn, one long extended note that went on and on, finally fading away. "Start counting," Will told Horace. The arrangement with Mallkallam was that the huge image of the night warrior would be projected 20 seconds after the horns stopped. As Horace counted, Will slipped out from under the cart, staying behind it so he was still shielded from the ramparts as he set the string on his longbow. He felt Horace begin to stir under the cart. "Come on out," he said, "but stay down." Horace crawled out into the open, half straightening behind the cover of the cart. They both peered into the dark sky above the castle. They wouldn't see the projection from here, but they might see the reflection of the light in the low clouds, Will thought. "There it is," said Horace. There was a brief flash of light in the sky. Then they saw the next demonstration as a ball of fire rose into the night, hissing and trailing a banner of sparks behind it before exploding high above the ground in a shower of red embers. Then the flash repeated itself, just for a few seconds. It was important, Mallkallam had told them, not to leave a projection in place for more than a second or two. Any longer, and the eye could focus clearly on it and realize that it was a crude outline that didn't move. But flashing it on and off like this, with other lights to distract the watcher's eyes, created a sensation of movement and uncertainty. "Let them think what they see, rather than really see it," Mallkallam had said. They could hear voices shouting on the ramparts now, as men reacted to the terrifying images shimmering in the fog. "Let's go," Will said. He drew his sacks and slashed the bindings that held the ladder on top of the cart's roof. Horace threw it easily over his shoulder, his shield slung over his back, and together they ran for the castle wall. Keren was in the main hall of the keep when he heard the shouting and the bang of the first rocket exploding. He was already armed and wearing chainmail, and he dashed into the courtyard, climbing the stairs to the south ramparts 2 and 3 at a time. The shouting was coming from that side, and he realized he had been right. This was where the attack was coming. He reached the ramparts and found the sentries gathered in a small knot, staring fearfully into the darkness. Their voices formed an incomprehensible babble as they all talked at once. "Silence!" he yelled, and, as they obeyed, he singled out the sergeant in charge. "Sergeant, what's going—" He got no further. Suddenly, in the dark night sky, some 200 meters from the castle's south wall, a gigantic shadow figure loomed against the mist. Huge, evil, terrifying, and gone almost as soon as it appeared. Keren actually staggered back at the sight of it. But then a demonic red face began to rise from the ground, soaring into the air and exploding into darkness. And even as it did, another massive shape loomed in the mist, the black shadowed outline of a dragon that seemed to quiver and shake and then disappear. A strange, hollow voice could be heard now, laughing hysterically. The sound chilled him. The men around him shouted in fear. Several dropped to their knees, doubled over as if to hide from the horrible sights before them. He kicked savagely at the nearest man. "Get up, you yellow-skinned coward!" he cursed. But his voice was hoarse and his throat was dry. He could feel the skin on his arms prickling and dimpling, and the hairs on the back of his neck rising in fear. Then, 50 meters from where they had first seen it, the giant warrior flickered on and off again. A series of colored lights flashed across the ground at the height of a man's head, and the laughter was back, more bone-chilling than before. Buttle appeared beside Keren, his face haggard with fear. He pointed wordlessly into the night as the dragon reappeared, then a huge lion, then the warrior again, all interspersed with images of that demonic face soaring into the air and disappearing. "It's sorcery!" he cried. "You said there was no sorcerer! Look at this, you fool!" "Get a hold of yourself," Keren snarled at him. "It's a trick. Nothing but a trick." "A trick?" Buttle answered. "A trick? How are they doing it? Explain that." Keren grabbed the man and shook him. "I don't know," he said desperately. "But they'll be coming at us soon, so get the men to the ramparts." He gestured at the cowering sentries, grouped together in fear and backing away from the wall as far as they could. "Can't you see? This is what Barton wants." More and more men had run from the east and west walls to view the terrifying scene outside the castle. As Buttle hesitated, half accepting that Keren might be right, they heard a voice shouting, "Here they come!" 3 men huddled nearby heard the call. Thinking that the monsters were now coming towards the castle, they broke and ran for the stairs. Keren moved too late to stop them, but the next man who tried to follow them met the point of his sword. "Get back to your position," Keren told him, and the man backed away. Keren glared at Buttle. The man was a coward and a traitor. He had known all along that he couldn't count on men like these, but he had hoped that the Scotti would arrive before he needed to. "They're coming!" the voice cried again, and this time he realized it was from the west wall, now dangerously short of defenders. In the dim light, he could see a tall figure, his sword rising and falling as the few men left tried to stop him. Beside him, a smaller, indistinct figure was balanced on the wall itself, in the act of firing a longbow. With a sick feeling, Keren realized he had been deceived. Worst, he had deceived himself. The real attack was on the west wall, and it was happening now. He grabbed Buttle's arm and pointed. "This is a diversion," he yelled. "Get the men over there and hold the west wall. I'm going to call out the rest of the garrison. I'll bring them up the northwest tower stairs and we'll catch them between us." Buttle, seeing a human enemy he could attack, nodded briefly. He turned and bellowed orders to the men on the south wall and then led them along the walkway to the southwest corner. Behind him, Keren was bolting down the stair to the courtyard. As he reached the cobblestones, he hesitated. The garrison dormitory was to his right, in the southeast tower. The keep was straight ahead of him, and that was where he ran. 3 of his men emerged from the keep as he reached the door. "Come with me," he ordered them, and plunged inside the central building.